Hello and welcome to this episode of What Will I Be When I Grow Up? My name is Cass and we're doing things a little differently today. A few days ago, we asked our audience to submit their question for today's guests, and I must say, you all delivered. I can't wait to get into them. Our guest is Dr. Jennifer Lay, a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Exeter. Her research explores the intersection of health, social, cultural, and lifespan developmental psychology. She is broadly interested in how we navigate and make sense of our social and solitary lives and how culture and development affect these processes. Welcome, Jen. We're happy to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, first, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What is your primary research focus in psychology and what drew you to this area?
Yeah, so my primary research focus is, as you mentioned, it's a kind of an intersection of different areas of psychology. And one of my key interests is on solitude. So the idea that, we all spend a significant proportion of our times by ourselves in everyday life. And it's a multifaceted experience. It can be lonely, it can be pleasureful, it can be relaxing, it can be isolating. And so all these different influences come into play in our experiences of solitude. And my background, so before psychology, it's actually a second career. My first career was as a geomatics engineer. And so I'm very obsessed with data and with with programming and those kinds of things. And but psychology is more of a passion. When I was an engineering student and working for a little while, I found that I was craving a more basic science rather than an applied science. And that in my spare time, I was reading about culture, philosophy, psychology. And so I ended up having a bit of a quarter life crisis, which hopefully has so far staved off the midlife crisis, and went back to school and couldn't be happier. I've been studying solitude since my PhD dissertation. It was a topic that my supervisor and I had a shared passion for, and using quantitative methods. So I do a lot of experience sampling, which means tracking people in their everyday lives, using smartphone-based questionnaires, so asking people repeated questions over the course of a couple weeks or several days, 5 times a day, 8 times a day even, asking, what are you doing right now? Who are you with? Are you by yourself? Are you with somebody? How are you feeling? Different emotions on various scales, and looking at how people change over time and why, the different lifestyle and influences that shape our experiences. And also combining that with biomarker data, so using research-grade Fitbits essentially to track things like heart rate, skin conductance, so stress, sweat responses, all indicators of physiological stress, and tracking people's locations, making audio recordings. And so combining all that data can give us a really comprehensive picture of what solitude looks like, and gives us indications of how it impacts our health and our well-being in the longer term.
See, I think solitude is something so interesting and so specific. So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about how you got into that as the subject that you wanted to study?
Yeah, it was kind of a shared personal interest with my supervisor. I mean, we were talking in her office one day, I think, about this loneliness epidemic that is very often talked about. I think it was certainly in the UK, also in Canada, where we're both located, certainly in East Asia as well. And thinking that, loneliness, of course, we know is bad for us. We know it's linked with depressive symptoms, with clinical depression, with cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality. But at the same time, my supervisor and I were both quite introverted and needing me time, needing some space to ourselves, and wondering, it's kind of a niche topic. Research on solitude from a psychological perspective, from an empirical perspective, only really started in the 80s. Research on privacy, and a bit more in the early 2000s. And lately, it's exploded a little bit. It's still a very niche topic, but it was something nice to study because it was less talked about. It provided an interesting angle to explore, kind of a unique angle, one that's maybe underappreciated. And recently, during COVID times, for example, people have started to talk about isolation, loneliness, but also positive side of solitude more.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read that in 2023, the World Health Organization declared loneliness to be a pressing global health threat, right? And they said that loneliness can be as bad for people's health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
Is that true?
It seems astounding, but that is what the science says.
Wow.
Yeah, if you look at the impacts of cigarettes on all-cause mortality, especially cardiovascular health, the effects of having high levels of chronic loneliness are quite similar, and not in terms of the types of disease necessarily, but the overall mortality impacts. And it's really important to remember here the difference between short-term and long-term loneliness. And so loneliness is one of these emotions that, we all have. It's normal, it's natural, and it's evolutionarily adaptive. It's a very important signal to us. When we're feeling lonely, it compels us to re-engage with the social world. It tells us that our social needs are not being met. And so it's a good prompt for us to re-engage. Right. And so in the short term, it's adaptive, it's helpful, it's useful. And yeah, it can be stressful, but, our physiological systems are such that we need, those boosts. A short-term amount of stress is motivating. But the issue is when it becomes chronic, when people are chronically isolated, disconnected, or for any reason at all. Maybe they have lots of people around them, but don't feel close to anybody. Not having that one close friend or that one close companion is very important. And that's when we see these issues, these chronic conditions come out.
I see. And I mean, it makes sense that loneliness is not a recent phenomenon by any means, but why do you think that it's now becoming a global health threat?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, or as you implied, it's not a new thing. I think it's just people are more aware of it now. Loneliness, I think, chronically speaking, has always been bad for us. It's always been an issue, but there's increased awareness of mental health, increased awareness, especially in our digital age, of people being disconnected despite having a lot of digital connections.
Yeah.
And I think it's largely more about awareness than about any specific increase in the health impacts. But, that's my opinion.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to pivot a little bit to talk about a little bit of your teaching. So I understand that you teach an undergraduate class at the University of Exeter all about solitude and social withdrawal across the human lifespan. And my first question for you about that is there a loneliest time in a person's life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, because people have assumptions, and then the science can sometimes say something different. And so this came up actually during COVID when people were trying to predict which age groups would fare worst under lockdown or under restrictions. And it was predicted by many lay people, many scientists too, that older adults would fare worse because, as we age, our social networks shrink anyway, because older people maybe are more physiologically vulnerable, mobility constraints. But in fact, it was young adults that fared the worst.
Right.
So as young people, so people who are university student age, and there's a lot of different factors that come into play here. Part of it is life phase, what people are doing at that age. Part of it is normative differences across the lifespan. So for example, people coming into a university, maybe moving across to a different city or a different country, and suddenly being in lockdown, having expectations of university life being about social activity and engagement, and having those expectations being dashed. And also being newly independent or relatively independent, living away from home for the first time can be very scary, can be really intimidating. And so the impacts of lockdown really were quite severe for a lot of students. And the other aspect is that even in the best circumstances, regular circumstances, our social needs change as we age. When we're young adults, we have more motivation to have broader social networks, to make new connections, to have a rich and varied social life, to have adventure, that sort of thing, exploration. As we age, as we become closer and closer to the point of death, or our perceived end of life becomes nearer and nearer, we reprioritize, or our priorities shift. We start to focus more on emotionally meaningful experiences and more familiar people, familiar experiences. And so we hold dear the people who are closest to us and spend less energy on people who are in our broader social network. So it's about quality connections over quantity. retaining the things that are good that we love, being close to the people that we love, rather than seeking out new connections. And so it can mean that people are better able to cope with solitude as long as they have these people that they're close to. And it could even be the case that people would rather be in solitude than being with people with whom they don't have a strong connection.
Right. Yeah. And you did mention it before, but loneliness can have its benefits, right? That's so counterintuitive to what I think a lot of people assume. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, it is like every emotion that we have, like anger, like anxiety, like fear, like sadness. These are all useful emotions. We have them for a reason. And I mean, doesn't feel nice to be lonely, certainly, but it's about what behavior it induces in us. It's an important signal to us. If we never felt lonely when we were by ourselves, likely, we wouldn't have that inducement to engage, and we wouldn't survive. We're social beings. And there's some recent research. For example, one of my PhD students that I'm co-supervising at University of Exeter, her name's Veronika Kosakova. She's looking at loneliness experiences among university students and how people can take that experience and use it as a source for post-traumatic growth. So loneliness can be traumatizing, especially in the circumstances that we just described, and going to university for the first time. But it depends what we do with it. It can be a source of strength if we're able to reflect, to grow from it, to derive, ways of coping that can serve us in other domains. And it can be something, I mean, it's painful in a useful way.
Yeah. I guess disconnecting allows us to connect better with people when we are around people as well, right?
Very well put. Yeah. It allows us to appreciate more. If we were never lonely, then why would we care for people?
Yeah, that's true. I think, I don't know, there's like this trend online where people are, I don't know, sort of like romanticizing the staying at home kind of like choice. Oh, I'm an introvert. I want to stay at home. And there's that sort of, I guess, sense of I need to unplug from people. And I think part of that's also, like a large part of that is due to social media. Because can anyone really be lonely nowadays when the internet's right there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And social media and the internet is such a contradictory thing. Because on the one hand, it makes us connected, to others in this digital sense, whether it's passively scrolling and watching people in their videos, or engaging actively, posting and commenting and such. On the other hand, this kind of passive engagement, if we are watching other people have fun, for example, that could make us, social comparison is a real killer. Or it could be, it's such a double-edged sword. It can connect us. I think of people who are, for example, living in small towns or in more constrained communities who feel different from others, thinking of transgender kids or people whose political views differ from the norm around them, connecting online with other people who share those views, share those experiences. And that can be so crucial for having a sense of belonging that they won't get in person. But on the other hand, if people, are using social media and online media to engage in communities at the expense of their in-person connections, then it could have the opposite effect.
Right.
Or especially when social comparison is happening, or when we're just kind of lost in our phones, but not connecting with our family and friends.
Like the people actually are right across from you.
Yeah.
So interesting. Okay. My next question is, how can one identify signs of maladaptive behavior to solitude, both in oneself and also in others? This question comes from, I guess, speaking for myself, in a Malaysian culture where it is ideal to maintain a certain quality of stoicism, or maybe not fully show your emotions to others. I think when that is the norm, it's difficult to then identify when my want or my hesitance to connect with other people comes from that, and then when that veers into maladaptive sort of territory.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of scope for being overly independent, or depending on what we expect people what we think people expect of us. Like if we expect that our parents or our family or society wants us to be autonomous and self-sufficient, then that can lead us to seek solitude in ways that are, maladaptive. It's all about striking that balance, I think, knowing when we need assistance and support and knowing, when we can pull back. And a lot of researchers, especially when it comes to child development and also lifespan development, speak about solitude as a skill. Being in solitude is a skill.
Oh,
yeah.
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's often framed as, we inevitably spend time by ourselves, sometimes by choice, sometimes not by choice. And it's what we do with it, especially cognitively, that makes all the difference. So if we're the kind of person who is prone to ruminating, loneliness and rumination really go hand in hand. If we're alone because we've been bullied or excluded or for whatever reason are withdrawing, and then sort of thinking about people, missed social opportunities, that ruminative spiral, that can lead to some quite negative mental health outcomes, to a lot of sadness. It can be linked with depression in the long term. But on the other hand, if we're able to distance ourselves from these negative thoughts, the skill of self-reflection, of self-distancing from your thoughts, it's linked with mindfulness as well. Training ourselves to sit with ourselves, to notice the thoughts that are in our minds, and to...
It sounds so nice.
It sounds so nice. And it's such a difficult skill.
I know. Yeah.
But when we're by ourselves, we have ourselves for company, our thoughts for company, and being able to... some people talk about how they have to be busy all the time in order to be having some activity that they're doing, whether it's work or some social thing, something in their schedule, because their thoughts are so oppressive.
Yeah.
And but solitude forces us to engage with those thoughts. And what I mean by solitude is no social media, no passive scrolling, nothing to distract us. What are our brains telling us? What are our minds telling us? And developing the skill of learning how to talk to ourselves nicely, self-compassion, being our own best friends.
Wow.
Because we are with ourselves, for life, really. We can't get rid of ourselves. So learning those tools for self-regulation, for emotion regulation, can be really beneficial. And the researchers talking about affinity for solitude, how children develop that, and mindfulness skills and life skills when it comes to self-talk, self-compassion, that becomes ever so important.
I see. And what about when we see maybe someone else, maybe someone who's older, kind of adopt these kind of behaviors that maybe where they find it difficult maybe to regulate themselves or really engage in that self-reflection. I think it's particularly hard when an older person can't admit that they're lonely.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that kind of person?
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, you mentioned the stoicism and really having this discrepancy between what people are telling others and what they're actually experiencing. And yeah, I think in older age, this certainly happens, wanting to be autonomous and independent, having to do with maintaining that autonomy. And I reckon even more so in Malaysia and Southeast Asian cultures and East Asian cultures, that idea of not wanting to be a burden on your family members, on younger people. And that's a really tough one.
Especially since you've probably been providing for your entire family your entire life. And when you get to a point where you have to say, oh, actually, I'm the person who needs the support, that kind of shift as well happens at that age. I'm just also really curious, is there a gender difference among older people in terms of loneliness?
Yeah. And so we do typically see gender differences. It really depends on the culture and depends on what age. But in general, so men versus women, men tend to have less broad social connections. And so that we see this quite a bit compared to women when it comes to effects of divorce in midlife and in young old age. Men fare a lot worse than women on average. Mainly because women are relying on a combination of different friends and family, a broader social support system. So when they lose their partner, whether due to divorce or due to widowhood, then there is still that support safety net. But men are more often relying on just their partner, or not exclusively necessarily, but largely their partner. And so after such a marital dissolution or, the death of their partner, they are much more prone to mental health conditions, to these negative consequences than women are. And this may also apply when it comes to the stoicism in old age, not wanting to rely on your family. I can imagine so. Yeah.
How has the current understanding around solitude changed or is
Mm.
changing in a world where quote unquote human interaction is becoming increasingly complex?
Yeah. Yeah. So researchers, I mean, this is a really important topic nowadays in the solitude literature, trying to define what exactly is solitude, knowing that we have so many modes of interaction, whether it's in
Yeah.
person or phone or video, texting, social media. And so there's a lot of different definitions floating around and a lot of excellent researchers who are trying to consolidate. And so we can think of a spectrum of solitude. So on one end of the spectrum would be pure solitude. So that's where you are physically alone. That's one element. And also there's no social interaction. You're not talking with anybody on the phone. And you're also not passively engaging with people. So no faces on your phone screen, no videos, no TikTok, none of that. But just being with your thoughts or, in nature, but without any humans around. That would be the most pure form of solitude. And then, on the other end of the spectrum would be perhaps you are in solitude in a crowd, maybe a bustling crowd of lots of people, maybe even at a party where you don't happen to be interacting with anybody or just, getting a drink or getting some food at a party, but you're kind of having a moment to yourself. But you still have the company around you, the energy, and you're not alone, you're among friends. That could still be considered solitude, but of a different variety, being alone in a crowd. And anywhere in between, being alone in your room, but engaging with social media to, as we mentioned, to feel less lonely, or perhaps it makes you feel even more lonely if you feel you're missing out. But yeah, definitions vary. And the increase in communicative technology just makes it
Right.
more complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's so, yeah, like I mentioned before, it's just so hard to unplug and really get that sense of pure solitude.
Mhm.
Do you think it's necessary for us humans to have pure solitude?
That's a really good question. Some would say yes, some would say not so much. I think the way that people answer this question, I think, depends a lot on our very own social needs. I mean, some of us, we differ in terms of how much solitude we need, how much social time we need. An introverted person may tell you, yes, I need me time every day for at least an hour, whereas others, would try to fill that time with social interaction. It's I wouldn't say it's necessary, but it's useful, especially when we look at the literature on nature exposure or disconnecting from a digital world. That seems to be quite useful, giving our brains a break, looking at tessellated patterns in nature, looking at things that are not human made. It kind of having quiet time to let our minds wander. Because often what happens in social interaction and in any task really is that we are focused on a task. We are, our minds are not allowed to wander so much. We are focused on the present. We're focused, on something that we're doing, some goal-oriented thing. But when we're in solitude without distractions, kind of a more pure solitude, then our minds wander more towards the past, towards the future. We tend to contemplate more, not necessarily deep thoughts, but whatever happens to come up for us that needs to be processed. We will start to feel these things more and to deal with problems that we have, whether subconsciously or consciously. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
It's hard to say how much we need. It really varies depending on the person. It varies depending on what we think is normal. So this cultural, social standards.
Yeah. I think about, my generation,
Mm.
which I think I got my Facebook account at 11 years
Mm.
old. And I'm thinking about, my dad who is 60 and just gone on Facebook. And then also the generations below me who were born into the social media era, right? And what you said about solitude as a skill, and the fact that not everyone will need the same amount of solitude. But I wonder, is there any sort of general trend for among the younger generation where maybe their need for solitude is less, lesser, or maybe any sort of trend about their ability to acquire the skills to be alone.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah, because there's so many influences that previous generations didn't have. These grabs for our time and for our attention. Yeah, I mean, my parents' generation, I mean, some of my family members of that generation are on Facebook, on social media. Some of them are not. But yeah, just the idea that these social media platforms are designed to grab us and to keep us in a loop of, scrolling and looking at videos and giving us the content that we
I think
want.
of the
And
iPad baby.
yeah.
Like they're just like not even at the table, like they're physically at the table, but they're
Yes.
just on their iPad
Oh
all
my
the time. And
gosh.
then
Yeah.
I would be like, oh my God, when I was their age, that was like a book, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Same here. Look
Yeah.
at my niece, who was at the time 18 months old, so a year and a half, and she was on YouTube scrolling, curating her content, finding the videos that she wanted,
Wow.
skipping the ads. Like, she knew how to do all these
They're
things.
so smart.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
I know. It's really
Yeah.
scary, I think, how fast technology is changing us
Mm-hmm.
and our ability to be with everybody else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's some good evidence that may shorten our attention spans. It may, hook people into ways of thinking that are less, I don't want to say less in depth, but a bit less, people are focused on things for a shorter amount of time.
Have you noticed any differences in your field of lifespan development psychology between the start of your journey and now? If so, what?
Yeah. Yeah. So I was studied in a lab in postgrad. It was an aging lab, and then I did a postdoc also in an aging lab, so in Vancouver, Canada, and then in Hong Kong. And noticing over the course of that there was an increasing emphasis on aging as perceptions of aging. So not just the fact that people differ as they age and change as they age, but that a lot of the impact of aging as a process depends on how the person themselves views aging. So the subjective view of aging. So if I myself or you yourself consider yourself to be old, you may respond to the world quite differently or think of yourself quite differently than if you consider yourself to be young. And if you ask people, for example, at age 50 or 60 or 70 or so, are you old? People have very different views about what is actually old. I talk to my dad sometimes and he'll say, 40 years old, so young, so healthy.
I know.
Whereas talk to a 20-year-old and that's just like, so old,
Yeah,
it's
I
like
know.
ancient.
Yeah, we were just having a chat with my colleagues just now, and she's turning 28, and another person was like, "Oh, that's basically 30."
If it's that somehow it's disparaging.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but the thing is, that colleague who's turning 28, she says, it's so weird because I feel like I'm 16.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that way. Yeah, and I do wonder because I feel that way too. That I feel like a teenager, and what does that even mean when we say this? Does it mean that we feel like there's options open? Does that mean that we feel that we're not responsible or that we're emotionally unstable? Does it?
So you also feel like you're at that. You're still a teenager?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Maybe 20s.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
But
then-
why? Like it's this specific part of our lives where like she thinks it's like high school age, and then you're like about like, is there something about that stage of life where like why do we keep coming back to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a developmentally important stage, and it's a stage that has really changed over the decades. I mean, if you think about, my parents, probably your parents' generation, marriage rates or the age at which you get married is lower. The age at which you have kids is lower. And now we have, this is increasing over the decades, but this period of extended adolescence, one could call it, that people are traveling more or going to school for maybe longer.
People are staying at home longer.
Staying at home
like,
longer.
It's more expensive to move out. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Delaying home purchase, delaying marriage, delaying kids. The age at first kids, I think I was reading somewhere is 31 now for women.
Wow.
And, even just 20 years ago, it was still, 25, 24. And and it's amazing. And eventually it'll plateau, I suppose. But it's really hard to say, but I think, because, those of us, like, for example, I'm middle-aged, but I never got married, never had kids. And I think that kind of, the life milestones, if we don't achieve, or we don't happen to engage in certain life activities at a certain age, that makes us feel young, or it makes us feel, some people may say feels behind. Others could say keeps you young or keeps you free. Yeah. And I think that has something to do with it. I mean, I wonder if your 28-year-old friend, if, they're, maybe not engaging in the kinds of milestones that are typical for somebody who's approaching 30.
Yeah.
I think it has something to do with it, but.
Yeah, but it's interesting that it's really the perception really precedes the actual reality.
Yeah.
And isn't that sort of a sign of how powerful our minds really are?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's really cliche to say we're only as old as we think we are, but.
Right. Yeah. But it's true.
It's true. Yeah.
It's true.
Actually, one of my favorite aging researchers, because, I study, lifespan development and I teach, in my solitude class, for example, a lot of stuff about old age. And sometimes it's hard to convince younger adults that they should care about older adulthood. It's a big deal. But then one of my favorite aging researchers, like Klaus Rothemund, he gave a talk that I was enamored with, talking about how older adults, they're literally us in the future. If we're discriminating against older adults, if we think somehow they're a different species, we're just discriminating.
When you're young, you just think you're invincible.
Yeah. And then midlife and older adulthood, well, it's so far away,
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And that won't be me.
It won't be me. No, never.
All right. My next question. In a world of polarization, violence, and climate change, what gives you hope for our future?
Yeah, very big question.
Yeah, big one.
I think, it's the opposite of solitude, but communication across political divides, across cultures. I mean, I think about, recent events in terms of elections and, a lot of right-wing things happening all throughout Europe as well, and how important it is to understand that we are all humans when we vote differently, when we have opposing thoughts and things that drive us to go a certain way politically or in terms of our life goals. There are always some shared values. And thinking of social media, I mean, it's very easy for us to get into echo chambers, depending on our leanings. But keeping open, I guess, try to stay friends on Facebook, on Instagram, with people who vehemently disagree with me politically, just to try to understand where they're coming from.
Right.
And, there's always some common ground. Ideas about, caring about family, caring about economic security. I mean, we can all understand that, I feel like, wanting to have a better future for yourself and for your kids, wanting to, promote life and abundance. Who doesn't like that? And this can lead to such different political opinions depending on how you interpret these values, depending on how you think they should be implemented. And having, conversations where you are treating each other as humans and as friends, disagreeing in reasonable ways, not attacking each other, but simply debating. It's really hard to achieve. So I try to keep my political opponents, I guess, very close. It's a difficult balance.
But you think as a whole we can do that?
I think we can if we try. Yeah. We can be open-minded and see the human first, see the human before the opinion.
I like that. I like that a lot. Okay. Now we're going to go into our last bit of the episode. This is a little new for us. It's time for a rapid fire round.
Okay.
Right. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions and you'll just answer them first thing that comes to your head. Okay. What was your first job?
It was an amusement park called Callaway Park. It was in Calgary in my hometown, and I was a rides operator.
Oh, cool. If you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Sushi. Easy.
I love sushi too. Describe Malaysia in one word.
Beautiful.
Would you ever appear on a reality TV show?
It depends on the kind of reality TV show.
What if it was a dating show?
No. Okay. No, I would do like adventure show, like Live Alone or in a Survivor. Yeah, I do Survivor. But if it involves anything to do with my family or social life, no.
Gotcha. Okay, and the last one. What's one bucket list item you want to check off in 2024?
I want to learn how to scuba dive, mainly because
Mm.
it's terrifying and therefore should be done.
Wow, I love it. I can't dive at all.
Neither
I can't
can
swim, actually.
I'm in the same boat. Oh, you can't. Oh,
I can't swim. It's really sad.
not at all. No, it's very normal.
All right, that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Jen, for talking with me. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much, Cass. This is so much fun.
Thank you. All right. Bye.